Peasants historically occupied the largest, poorest, and least represented class in society across all nations, and so they would remain. They did, however, make small advances in the Western European countries like France and England. French peasants were allowed their own land, but it was hardly enough to provide for a family. They had to rent and take on the work of nobles' estates and everything that came with that socio-economic relationship. The peasants were subject to certain feudal dues or obligations to their seigneurs, lords, called banalities. A peasant might owe dues or banalities to multiple seigneurs if they had rented lands from different lords. The nobles who owned serfs were able to exercise a large amount of control over them because there were no laws protecting the peasants and it had been tradition for centuries. Peasants were taxed very heavily in addition to their manorial duties. Nobles oftentimes would not be taxed as a way to make sure the nobility wouldn't rebel against the monarchy. This was especially the case in France, where the Third Estate shouldered the majority of taxes which supported many foreign wars, while the nobles paid little to nothing. Another aspect that was holding back peasants was the fact that nobles controlled the government in their roles as justices of the peace and advisors to the monarch. These nobles helped to drive policies such as corvée, or forced labor performed by peasants each year. This labor would often be used to build roads from a noble's estate to the market, or an important project of some kind. The economy of Western Europe, being more coastal and closer to the Atlantic, had put an emphasis on their commercial activity, trade, shipbuilding, imports, middlemen, and therefore had taken some pressure off their agricultural base. The for the most part non-coastal Central and Eastern European nations like Poland, Russia, Austria, and the German lands fell harder into agricultural production as it was the basis of their economy, and they now exported goods to Westerners who were producing less. Serfs had the worst lives in Russia, where they were counted as a measure of wealth by their lords, which meant not even remote consideration in government. Instead of comparing how much land they owned, nobles would discuss how many serfs they had to figure out who was wealthier and exercised complete control over them. The serfs had no legal protection against being murdered or exiled to Siberia. They could demand up to 6 days of labor, known as barshishna, from the serfs. In 1767, Catherine the Great called a legislative body with representatives from every Russian class to advise on law. But even Catherine, being the self-proclaimed enlightened despot that she was, did nothing to reform the autocratic system in Russia. In southeastern Europe, peasants had a lot more freedom. The Ottoman Empire had fewer policies that restricted serfs, and the class hierarchy separated free men from villeins, or serfs. The lords still tried to assert control over serfs, however. The rights and freedoms of serfs were often aided by a lack of labor. A higher demand for labor meant serfs could demand more and move from one lord to the next without being sent back to the original landlord. The differing statuses of serfs often led to a continuous cycle of revolts. Between 1762 and 1769, there were over 50 of them in Russia, the most famous being Pugachev's rebellion. Since Russian serfs had the worst quality of life, they admired their Western counterparts' low, albeit existing level of freedom, and despised their current situation, which was only made worse by Peter the Great granting villages to nobles and Catherine the Great taking other action against serfs. Pugachev's rebellion was the largest revolt by the serfs in Russia's history. In a rebellion from 1773 to 1775, a disgruntled army lieutenant named Yemelyan Pugachev rallied Cossacks against the Russian government. He was quite successful, as the response by the government was inadequate. The rebellion was eventually stamped out, and its end halted further efforts to improve Russian serfdom. Nobles held very envious positions, and as such held many privileges exclusive to them. In England, only the nobility was authorized to hunt game animals. Anyone who was not a substantial landowner, including wealthy merchants, were legally barred from this activity, and to do it was considered a capital offense. The wealthy, being the primary controllers of parliament and the justice system, had the government at their disposal, backing their excessive claims to hunting rights. Poaching, however, was widely performed. When the economy declined and food was scarce, many peasants and less wealthy farmers resorted to poaching as a means to eat, and the black market developed in the cities where a piece of poached meat could fetch a very high price.